I visited my grandma the other day and really sat with her for like an hour or so. I usually like hearing old people talk. If their brain is still sharp, they can remember a lot of life experiences and just pass them on. Of course, they may also carry superstitions that are just insane to believe today, but I will just talk about that later. One of the things that old people talk about a lot is death. And it's a topic that I only get with them. Of course, when I'm around people my age, in like school or whatever, the concept of death just doesn't appear. Sure, we maybe had 1 or 2 friends that passed away in school or something, but 99% of the people that you know in kindergarten or primary school is still alive today. That can't be said for people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. If a person is in their 90s, it's almost guaranteed that all of their childhood friends are dead. Even older folk, like people in their 30s and 40s, like middle-aged guys, they don't really talk much about death at all. I've asked my uncles, my lecturers, my parents, the adults in my life, and death doesn't really come to them like that still. They may had a couple of more friends that died, yes, but most of their friends from the good old days are still alive and doing well. Death is a conversation that a lot of younger people fear, and I really fear death too. But my grandma talking about death makes it feel like a regular Thursday afternoon. She would casually talk about deaths that occurred over the past week that happened to friends, and she would just simply brush it off as if it had no effect on her. I can't imagine having this feeling at all. A thing about old people is that they reminisce. And I mean a lot of reminiscing. It's never usually about the present or the future, it's always about what they did in the past. Now, I think when a guy does it in his 20s, it's pathetic, but when you are talking to like an old grandma, it makes a bunch of sense. They have almost nothing in store for life anymore. Their mileage for their car is just pretty much running out. Why talk about the future when there is nothing there? And I can't imagine waking up and facing this reality that there is nothing for me anymore. Waking up and thinking that maybe you may die this year, or the next year, or the next decade. Who knows when you die? If I wake up today and realize that I could die at any second, I would just prefer to off myself today, if I'm being honest. I simply can't stand like the suspense of dying. Like, oh, am I dying today or am I dying tomorrow? You never know, because anything that happens to you, you know that you can't recover from. If you got like some insane disease like cancer happen to you when you're like in your 20s, you know that most of the time you're going to beat it. But cancer in your 90s, bro, you're probably going to die. Of course, you know tomorrow is not guaranteed. Even if you're like a young person, you know, you can be run over by a bus or something. Anybody can die tomorrow, whether you're like old or not. But like the chances of dying as a regular ass teenager are like a 1 in a million. Whereas for like a 90-year-old, that's probably 1 in 100. And eventually you are going to be unlucky one day and hit that 1 in 100 chance and die. Right now, life is moving incredibly fast for me. I've spoken about this on my video time, and it's mostly because I've gotten busy and have a lot of priorities stacked up with me. The weeks are going really fast, too fast in my opinion. I don't feel the weeks at all. No matter how much time passes, as a young person, you just say, oh well, the week just passed, and just carry on with life. But as a old person, that is a bit scary to see when time passes so fast, because you know that your time is very limited. It could end at any second, and unless I get very unlucky, I'm given to have another decades of life ahead of me at the very least. When I see old photos of my grandma and her friends, it feels rather creepy, because at this point maybe half of them have passed on, and to see their faces still living, still smiling through the photo is a very surreal experience, believe me on that. So what about life after death? Of course, that's a Biggie album, but as a young person, you really get caught up in the now. A lot of things, especially at my age, happen a lot at once. You take them seriously, you react quick, you put them at the top of your mind, and then that thing is settled, and you are basically moved on to the next thing quite subconsciously. And how much of that old thing do you remember? For example, let's say you had a vacation that you did 5 years ago. How much of that do you really remember today? You may still remember a couple of photos in your mind, maybe a highlight very vividly, but other than that, it will be a blur. The finer details like the conversations, the ride, how the day went, the people there, you forgot all of these things, definitely. And that was just 5 years. How much of that vacation will you remember in 10, 20, maybe even 50 years from now? In 50 years, you would probably have questioned if that vacation really happened at all. I think the anxiety that a lot of people forget is that we are in a very active period in our lives. Shit is basically happening to us every day. And the stress that comes from that is that we treat everything that happens to us as important, when in reality maybe 5% of that is. My grandma still has very good memory of her childhood, like her memory is like insane for her age, and she still has endless stories to tell me whenever I sit down and talk to her. But it's clear that she may have also forgotten a lot of stories too. Maybe stories that her mother told her will also be lost due to time too. And she may remember some stories, but she just never got the chance to express them and pass on to me. So those stories go to the grave with her. Of that 100% that happened in her life, maybe she remembers 30% of it, and maybe she would have given half of that to me. And how much of that 15% would I remember? Maybe a third of it. And how much of my grandma's memories am I going to transfer to my kids? Maybe even a fraction of that? It's crazy that by 100 years or so, your existence will pretty much disappear, at least for 99% of people. Life after death for my grandparents ends with me, and if me and all my other cousins die, her memory is practically gone. My kids may remember the face of my grandmother just as I know the face of my great-grandmother, but I would have zero clue what she sounded like, what her personality was, and her true self. Death is really cruel, it really is. My grandma describes aging like this: it's like a sort of thing that develops over time. Maybe a random spot will pop up, maybe a new ache will happen across your body, maybe your legs are ever so slightly weaker. It just happens every day. You don't notice it, but take a peek at what you were a decade ago and you can really see the accumulation that aging has done to your body. She would kill to be my age again and to experience the 21st century, just as she had experienced the 20th century, but she can't have both. And I know that I will never get to experience the 22nd century, at least not in any meaningful way. I'll be too old, too frail by then. My dad told me that the majority of adults born during the 1900s died before he even graduated high school. They may have had 60 to 70 years, maybe 80 years if they got lucky. I'm assuming at least 70 to 90 years of my life if all goes well. But even then, even if I reach the 22nd century, somehow, I will be nearing a century old by then. The majority of people born especially in the earlier decades of a century will never experience the next century. It may happen because technology has been going crazy these past few years, but even then, my chances of that are slim. There could be so many ways I could go out too. When you're young, the diseases that you get are minor, maybe like a common cold, maybe COVID as well, but like COVID for like people my age is just like a minor disease. I don't think a lot of people got really affected by COVID. Like the majority of my friends that got COVID and me myself, we didn't really have many symptoms. And even if you do get really serious ones like cancer, they happen very few and far in between. When you look through Wikipedia pages of like dead people, most of them died to diseases that I've never heard about. And I definitely knew that they didn't know the existence of these diseases until they got it. Tunku Abdul Rahman, considered to be one of Malaysia's great founders, passed away at 1990, God rest his soul. And God technically did rest his soul, considering he passed peacefully in his sleep. Now that's the type of death I would want, especially after having all my affairs and my wills in order. Apparently passing peacefully just means cardiac arrhythmia, which is basically just your heart suddenly beating very irregularly and you just die. It happens more in older people, but if they get it in their sleep, they just die a painless death. They don't feel it. It's a very gloomy subject about death and such, I know that, but I'm not a goth, never have been. It's just a very taboo subject, and I imagine some people here watching this video, especially for the people that I'm intending this video for, to be quite religious and may view this video as haram, as sinful, as anything that violates their religion as a whole. I'm not really interested in bringing death into religion, at least for this topic. I'm quite a religious person myself, but I think understanding and talking about death is super important to like gain a better understanding of it. Even if religion says no, it's bad, I don't believe that. I think understanding is really important. And if you're like an atheist or just generally don't give a shit about religion at all, then great, I don't need to worry about that. I'm just gonna leave you with this, because if you sat through this entire video of me talking about death, then I think you deserve this advice that I carved out from this experience. Know that 50% of what happens to you today will not affect you tomorrow. The other 25% will not affect you next week. The other 15% will not affect you next month. The next 9% will not affect you next year. But 1% of the things that you do today will affect you for the rest of your lifetime. So you just gotta find your thoughts and put them in these categories. Will this thing affect you next week? If they don't, drop them. Those thoughts are just not important. Just do this every day for like 15 minutes. It's just meditation. Sorting out all of your thoughts and see which ones do matter and which ones that don't. And you start to notice that life stops feeling so overwhelming after you realize that 90% of it does not matter at all.